2 months ago, some of my high school friends and I drove up to Boston. One of our high school classmates was being honored by the medical community up in Boston as one of the best doctors in Boston. She had just finished practicing 20 years. And so they had a huge celebration. She got a nice honor, nice dinner, and then we all went out as friends. And we got out as friends who don't tell the same fancy stories that you tell at these big banquets about how wonderful they are. You tell the stories of when they were in high school and when they were struggling. And so we all had this great impression of our friend Mary, because Mary, as long as we remember her, always wanted to be a doctor. Even in high school, she excelled in everything. We used to go around calling her Dr. Calorie. Now she's married to Dr. O'Brien. But she would come to class prepared. She's a smart woman. But then oddly enough, she'd be at home and her mother would tell stories about how she put on the doctor's coat and wear the stethoscope. And for the holidays, as gifted as she was, instead of giving her some clothes as a teenager, they give her one of those baskets, those doctor's baskets, or another stethoscope. All her life, she has always wanted to be a doctor. And she's practiced over and over again, day in and day out. What was striking about her acceptance speech, though, was she did not speak about so much about the glories, but the challenges of the medical profession. And for those of you in the medical profession, you are perhaps more keenly aware of it than any of us. She says, the insurance difficulties that so many people face, she says, I face too, because either I have to redirect them or turn them away, and it's painful for me. She says, and truth be told, money is not everything. You see, her medical career at the very beginning was challenged. She just got married. She immediately got pregnant. She ended up having 5 kids in 6 years. And she found herself in incredible debt after medical school. And even during medical school, I remember how frustrated she was that many times she just wanted to throw it all in and go home. But she had a goal. She had a goal of being a medical professional, being that doctor and distinguishing herself from others in being attentive in care, mindful of patients, and as her testimony said, a skilled diagnostician. Her goal of being a phenomenal doctor is what sustained her in those tough days, in those challenging days. That's made her who she is today. I think of that example as I think about the second virtue of hope that I'd like to speak about a little today. Hope. Our Holy Father has written in that second encyclical, Spe Salvi, on hope. It's who we are as Christians. It's part and parcel of what we're about. Hope is what sustains us. Hope is what gets us through the days. Hope is what got my friend Mary through those difficult times, through those difficult moments. Hope of getting a degree, hope of being a good doctor. It's the overarching goal that sustains us all the day long. We keenly are aware that as much as we're to enjoy this life, God has made us for eternal life. It's the fundamental catechetical question. Why did God make us? God made us to know Him, to love Him, to be happy in this world and serve Him, and to be happy in the next. Our ultimate goal is salvation. And as we look at that salvation, the glory that's ours in that one day, we in turn deal with the difficulties and the strifes that come our way. How do we do that? Well, I think first we think about the people in our life who have been hopeful in the midst of some of the greatest challenges of their lives. I think of one of my favorite stories of Job. I don't know if I would have stayed with God in the midst of all of Job's suffering and pain and his constant nagging and bullying from his friends to give up on God. But he knew that God had a plan and that God in the end would win out. I admire Job a great deal. Job is one of those examples. In the Holy Father's letter, as you are keenly aware, he used the example of the great Saint Josephine Bakhita and many other saints and holy people. And how many of us have the stories of the saints written on our hearts and engraved in our minds? Those are the stories that sustain us, that give us hope. I suspect also the stories of our families. Men and women, our parents particularly, who struggled day in and day out, yet did not lose faith because they had hope in God. As a priest, mind you, as a young priest, I thought I knew everything. So 20 years ago, I thought, as you heard early on in this week, you heard I went and tried to evangelize the woman at Clover, and it turned on me in a moment's notice. I paralyzed with fear one day. I walked in the Germantown hospital, and I'm not good. Even though my mother was a nurse, my father was a cop, I still am learning about being present to people in hospitals. What do you say? You go to a wake, you say, I'm sorry. What do you say to someone in the hospital you don't know the condition? So I walk in the hospital, and I'm staying there, and the woman I suspected was asleep. So I just sat there, and I was sitting there praying. And she looks up and she says, you're the priest, you're supposed to say something comforting. And I was paralyzed with fear and scared to death. And I said, I have nothing to say. But then she went on to say, she says, I'm not afraid. She told me her condition was terminal. She says, I'm not afraid. I said, you're not afraid? I'm more afraid for you than you are. She says, God has given me a great life. And God promised me a long time ago in baptism that God would take good care of me. God's not going to abandon me now. God promised if I were faithful to him, God would be faithful to me. I was kind of blown away at that point. And yet, that hope is what sustained her. Where does our hope lie? We come Monday after Monday to refuel that hope, to get that fire of hope going. And sometimes we find ourselves saying, we can't go on. We have so many bills, we have so many problems, our family's in disarray, our difficulties are immense, we take so many medication, we feel like we're the CVS store itself. We find ourselves just overwhelmed. And yet people look to us as devotees of Mary because they see hope in us, that we keep coming back to God through the Blessed Mother, because we find that this relationship with God is worth living, that in God we find our hope, in God we find our salvation. There are three enemies. If you remember our catechism, there are three enemies to hope: despair, sloth, and presumption. Despair, sloth, and presumption. I never get that second word right, so bear with me. Despair, giving up hope. It's not worth it. Throwing in the towel. What does that achieve? I tell my students over and over again, give it a try. Give it a shot. What's the worst can happen? So you fail, and you learn. We give it a shot. We have confidence in this God. Sometimes it's successful and turns out for our good, but in the end, it always turns out for God's good. Sloth. Remember back to our basic theology lesson. Grace builds on nature. So, my students who take their books before an exam and say, Professor, this is the key. I'm going to put this right underneath my pillow, and I'm going to pray God that this seeps into here, and then seeps onto that paper. That's sloth. We need to cooperate with God's grace. The last piece is interesting. Presumption. Somewhere along the way, we've gotten the presumption that in the end, all will be saved. All have the opportunity to be saved. But we must work out our salvation in this world. And that's why we come to receive the sacraments day in and day out. My friends, we have an incredible goal of eternal life. The eternal life where God dwells with us, with all our beloved ones in the heavenly kingdom. That goal makes us energized, and up to the tasks that come our way. God does not promise us a perfect life, but God does promise us to be with us all our days.